Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Yacht Crew Logs right here on Yachting International Radio. My name is Ria. I am your host, and I'm very pleased to welcome my next guest. He is Rob, the CEO of Tropic Ocean Airways. Welcome.
Hi, Ria. Great to be here. Thank you so much. Really excited.
I'm really excited to find out all about Tropic Ocean Airways. But first, one thing I wanted to ask you about is, without revealing my age, but you were a Top Gun pilot, which everybody can think back to Top Gun and, of course, Tom Cruise and that whole thing. Tell us a little bit about your history and what brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, thanks, Rita. It's funny. I kind of date myself too when I talk about how that movie came out when I was 11 and changed the course of my life. So my dad was from Southern Italy. He was a teenager during World War II and in Southern Italy. So like the American military liberated his town. And so when he got older, he moved to the state and brought us up in this like patriotic household to appreciate the freedoms that we have in the U.S. because his town was overrun by the fascists and the Nazis. And it's funny enough. So I started watching all these military movies with him when I was a kid. And I said, look, I'm going to be an Air Force pilot. I saw Chuck Yeager in The Right Stuff, if you remember that movie. And then that movie, Top Gun, comes out. And I think I saw it like 7 times in the theater. He took me back and forth. I had a birthday cake with jets on it. And I was like, wait a second. You could ride motorcycles. You could land on boats. I love the waters. You could be on a ship and fly off the ship. I'm like, date your instructor. Like, this is the coolest thing ever. So from that moment on, I wanted to be a Navy pilot. So yeah, I joined the Navy in 2001. And I honestly, very fortunate to have a ridiculously great career. My first career, I keep joking, I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up. Still trying to figure that out. But my first part of it was I flew fighters. So the F-14 pilot, transitioned to the F-18 Super Hornet, and then I flew the F-5 as an adversary. So we played the bad guy. And I always like to say that the F-14 was the jet in the first Top Gun. The F-18 was the jet in the second Top Gun. And the F-5 played the bad guy in the first Top Gun. So I've flown 3 jets in 2 Top Gun movies. So that's like my claim to fame. But yeah, it was an amazing career. I deployed around the world, did an Iraq tour as well. And I think we were talking about it earlier, the experiences and the lessons and the training really helped me establish the business that we have today and create a successful model that actually works.
What took you then from being the Top Gun that you were, and still are, because that doesn't go away, over to amphibious planes? Because I can imagine going to commercial airlines or private jets, etc. But you went over to amphibious planes. Why was that?
Yeah, I never wanted to be an airline pilot. Like all my friends get out, fly for Delta and American, and they make good money and barely work. And they're all bored. And I always thought to myself, look, I really wanted to start a business later in life, like an aviation business. And I was going to do it when I retired. And when I was a kid, obviously, Jimmy Buffett, I was a huge Jimmy Buffett fan, read all of his books about the seaplane adventures. Where's Joe Merchant? Frank Bahama was the seaplane pilot in that book, a former Navy pilot who became a seaplane pilot. So it's cool. And flew in Chalk when I was 16 years old over to Bimini. And I just fell in love with it. And I fell in love with the idea of seaplanes. I think seaplanes creates kind of a sense of freedom. So when you're flying on a big airplane, you fly from Miami to LaGuardia, right? When you're on a seaplane, you could look down and be like, man, that looks like a really cool beach. Let's go check that place out. And it creates this sense of adventure and freedom, right? So I was going to do this when I retired in my 50s, and so I'm 48 now. And I was riding a motorcycle in Southern Italy with a buddy of mine. I was reading Screw It, Let's Do It by Richard Branson on that trip in 2009. And I got back from the trip and I'm like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to start a business now. So decided to start it then. And it just happened to coincide with the time I was stationed in Key West, which is the best kept secret in the Navy because you get to fish and boat and dive and still fly fighters, which is really cool. And my mom was in Fort Lauderdale and she had fallen and broken her hip. So I had to drive 4.5 hours. And I was like, man, there's got to be a better way to get to Fort Lauderdale from here. And there's no like direct small service. So when I established the business, actually our first route was Key West to Miami as we try to get it off the ground. And I went through this time where, this 2008, 2009, where the banks weren't going to lend you money. The airlines were struggling. So every time I talked to a bank and said, hey, I need to raise capital. I need to borrow money to buy an airplane. I got laughed at. I literally got laughed at banks. Are you serious? Went through a period of time where I had to sell my house, my car, my boat, everything I had, bought a little 4-seat airplane. I met a gentleman who had a small bank that actually helped us finance the first 2 airplanes, which is great. And we launched this little business in 2011 with one 4-seat seaplane and created the routes around Florida, then Florida to the Bahamas. So we relaunched Miami to Bimini service in 2011. They hadn't seen it since Chalk Scratch in 2005. And then since then, from fast forward to today, we're the largest amphibious airline in the world, the largest seaplane airline on the East Coast of North America. And we now launched a Bahamian airline as well that flies domestically within the Bahamas. So we fly 45,000 people, 6,000 flights in multiple regions every year.
The biggest problems, I think, too, with the Caribbean is that it's really difficult to get where you want to go. I know when it comes to the charter shows in the Caribbean, when people from Europe head over, it takes them a long time because there is so many little island hops that have to be done. And it's very difficult to get where you're wanting to go.
It is. There's such a lack of connectivity. And it's funny, if you look on the other side of the world, when you look at the Maldives, 500 islands, I think it is. Oh, no, 1,200 islands and keys across 500 miles. They embraced seaplane service back in the 80s, and became the number one luxury archipelago in the world. Now you look at the Bahamas, which is 700 islands and keys across 700 miles, and they have 64 runways. I think 50 something are commercial runways. And that's how people get around. And we've looked at it. We kept working with the government, and this administration has been very forward thinking now, because when you take an island and you want to create connectivity, you don't want to take half the island, raise it, destroy the reef, destroy the beach to build a runway at an airport. It makes no sense. So if you look at the Maldives, all we need is a dock. The dock is minimal impact. These airplanes are a boat on the water, essentially, when they're on the water.
There's already docks everywhere in the Caribbean anyway, right?
Exactly. You have all these we need protected water, protected marinas all over the Caribbean. So we've been successful at creating this network in the Bahamas. Pre-pandemic, we were actually flying into the Virgin Islands. We were flying into Virgin Gorda, Necker Island, Mosquito. And we were just opening Road Harbor, the cruise ship terminal, or Road Harbor, and then the pandemic hit. So we're looking at going back there and probably next year. And again, trying to create this connectivity. But that's a challenge because I think there's an archaic view of seaplanes. People think of the 1960s airplane with the single pilot, the beard and the can of oil in his back pocket and the whole thing. And
that's what I grew up with in Canada.
Exactly.
Everything was put together with duct tape, and you were wondering whether or not this would ever get off the ground, let alone land back on water or wherever.
Which is cool, right? And it creates the lift you need to these remote areas, but you can't establish an airline and create routes based on that. You have to have like a structure in place. So I like to call it the airline in a box. We've created like the Chick-fil-A of seaplane airlines, where everything is process and procedure and training based on US Navy and the single type of airplane. And we could pick that up and stick it down anywhere in a region that's challenged with airlift. And we did that in the Bahamas, and it's slowly becoming a very successful way to get around the Bahamas.
So what's next for you guys? Are you going to continue to expand within the Caribbean as a whole? Is that sort of your goal as time goes on?
Yeah, great question. So we look at the routes as a vehicle. So we don't just fly people, right? So we can fly provisioning. We actually launched a medevac service now. So if someone gets hurt on a yacht and they're in a small protected harbor, we land next to the yacht. We have medical personnel on board and stretchers, and we could get people off the yacht and direct to Miami International to get treatment. We work with the cruise lines on medevacs. Once you create that route structure, now you can really expand the different services with that route structure. And that's currently what we're doing right now. We're increasing our cargo offerings. We're increasing the medevac offerings, and we're creating more routes that you can then run the different services. So it's not just the luxury travel. We actually have scheduled by the seat service to certain locations as well. So although we look like we're a luxury charter company, you book a seat to Bimini out of Fort Lauderdale for $300. And it's there, you get there in 20 minutes versus an hour and a half in TSA and all this other stuff. So we're creating that direct service. We're trying to expand that throughout the Bahamas. We are looking to go back to the Caribbean to offer these services there. The challenge in the Caribbean is you have multiple different countries and none of them work together. So you have multiple, like the alphabet soup of regulatory bodies. So you need to get approvals from each regulatory body. And like I said, we were very successful at getting these things done in Antigua, the BVI, Puerto Rico, pre-pandemic. The pandemic kind of set us back. So the intent is to go back there and recreate that strategy again next year.
One of the things that I find really fascinating about your company as well is that you hire local. So that gives you a little bit more of a special feel, because the people that you're getting on the plane with have that. And because it's more intimate when we're talking about a seaplane or amphibious plane, it's more intimate. They have that ability to talk to the people that they're on board with and find those secret little spots and those special places that normally they wouldn't.
Absolutely. The airline we helped launch called Coco in the Bahamas. Normally, a seaplane airline would launch within the Bahamas and they would hire U.S. pilots on work permit. And why? The answer is there's no seaplane pilots in the Bahamas. I said, okay, I was a fighter pilot for the Navy. I landed on ships. I didn't know how to do that before the Navy hired me. The Navy doesn't say, hey, does anybody know how to land on a carrier? Like they train them. So we worked with the government. I established the training program within the Bahamas. So now when you check in, you're checking in with our sales staff who might be from Eleuthera. Maybe you're going there. They're going to tell you where to go, right? When you get on the plane, you've got two Bahamian pilots that know the islands better than any of us would ever know. And by the way, it's a job creation piece for them too. So we're creating these direct jobs. And then now that was really cool about the seaplane service is now you're flying people to remote areas and taking them bone fishing. So now that area has a blue economy it didn't have before. So now people are buying bone fishing boats. So now it's like creating all these indirect jobs. And then now you've got developments that are saying, like, wow, there's air service to this island. Maybe we should add some homes that we can rent out and bring more tourists in. And it's just like this indirect impact. And it all comes from, again, establishing a local business and hiring local. And our model is to do that in the BVI, to do that in Antigua. Maybe we talked about maybe Europe. And we know we can do it really well. It's just getting over the regulatory hurdles early on is always the challenge.
It's interesting because during the pandemic, I was doing a podcast called Secrets of the Caribbean. And I spoke to many people throughout the Caribbean. And I think one of the biggest issues that everybody had was that the families were being separated because they would have to go to the mainland or the US in order to find work or school. And so when somebody comes in and creates an economy within the borders, I think that's very much appreciated because the families can stay together. And there is a profession that kids can look forward to taking on and bringing the money back in to their islands or their villages.
Yeah, absolutely. The diaspora is pretty big for Bahamas. And I think one of the goals of this government is to bring people back. They go to school in the U.S. and then they stay in the U.S. So we're personally working with some schools here that are local colleges that have large groups of Bahamian students to create intern programs. So that way when they graduate, they go back to the Bahamas. And I know as the Bahamas there's a lot of investment going into the Bahamas right now because of post-COVID. A lot of people moved from the Northeast to South Florida. Now they're looking out to the Bahamas to be the second Hamptons, blah, 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 blah. So there's just a lot of opportunity in the Bahamas. And historically, it was just very challenging to get these kind of things done. And I think this administration's been very forward thinking with, okay, how do we create a sustainable future for our people? So you're starting to see that really exciting things like roll out, such as the partnerships with universities and things like that. It's really cool to see.
I have to say, it sounds very exciting. And it's really good to know that perhaps not this year, but as time goes by, it's going to make travel for crew and those going for shows a heck of a lot easier and a heck of a lot quicker.
Yeah, that's our goal, right? When I do business in the Caribbean, it takes me a day and a half to get anywhere. And it's insanity. And I told you the story before. I met a girl who was in the BVI who was going to see her boyfriend in the Bahamas. And it took her 35 hours with an overnight in Miami just to get there. So a round trip is over 60 hours of travel. And I joked, I said, look, in 1969, in 60 hours, we flew from the Earth to the moon. Like it's ridiculous that there's no direct connectivity in the Caribbean. It's really tough to get around. I think people understand it. The challenge is, again, can't build more runways. So I do look at amphibious travel as being a great solution to getting people around. And in 10 years, you're going to have the electric vertical takeoff and landing air taxi stuff. But you've got to establish that route structure now. And by the way, the facilities that we use, a dock, you could land an electric thing with 10 years on it, right? So you just need to create that route structure now. And I think we're starting to see the country start to embrace it. But there's no reason that it should take a day and a half to go from Miami to a meeting in Antigua or something like that.
As the crow flies, how far is that?
Yeah. So we don't fly from Miami to the Southern Caribbean, but what we do is we create the last mile, right? So if you were trying to get to Virgin Gorda in the BVI, this obviously big yacht with the basin there and stuff, you would fly into we'd fly into St. Thomas or Puerto Rico on American. and then connect on our flight, and we take you straight into Virgin Gorda. Historically, you would connect in San Juan or St. Thomas. You'd have to then fly into the BVI. Then you have to take a 20 or 30-minute taxi ride to a boat. Then you got to take an hour and a half boat ride. It's just, oh, by the way, you're going through TSA and all this stuff. So it's just the Seaplane Service Direct saves time. So we're doing a demonstration in Paradise Island, actually in Nassau on Tuesday. The first time seaplanes have landed in Paradise Island since CHOCS 2005. We did one demonstration with Jimmy Buffett on board a couple of years ago, which is really cool. But this is going to open up Paradise Island. And if you're familiar with Nassau, for example, in the Bahamas, Paradise Island, you have the Atlantis Marina, you have the one and only Ocean Club, you've got Hurricane Hole Marina. So there's a lot of yachts on Paradise Island. If you fly into Nassau on JetBlue, our TSA and all flight, then you end up in Nassau. You got to go through customs. You might get behind like the British Airways flight and spend an hour in customs. And then you've got to take a 45-minute to an hour drive out to Paradise Island, depending on travel. It takes you hours. Whereas what we're going to create out of Fort Lauderdale is you show up 30 minutes prior, you get on the seaplane, an hour and 10 minutes later, you're landing at Paradise Island. So it cuts it in half. And that's what the direct seaplane service can do. That's really cool. And by the way, for the yacht, right? So if you have a yacht in Southern Exumas and you have people coming in from the UK to board the yacht, you don't have to move the yacht back to Nassau. You could keep the yacht where it is in some little harbor somewhere, which I think is more exciting than being in a big marina anyways, right? And then they get off the BA flight, they jump on the Bahamian airline called Coco, and in 30 minutes, they're landing right next to the yacht and getting on the boat and bringing crew
and
out.
Realistically, the cost of that flight is probably cheaper than the cost of the fuel to go back to the biggest marina.
Absolutely. And oh, by the way, when the plane is coming in to do that transfer, it could also be bringing in supplies, right? Things like that. So it's a really cool offering, I think, for the market that we do a lot of it. We just haven't seen it expand yet because I don't think too many people know that it exists just yet.
It's time we shout out. I will make sure to put all of the information for both Coco.
Coco's the Bahamian airline, Coco Bahama Seaplane. And then you have Tropic Ocean Airways, which is our Florida to the Bahamas. And we also operate in New York, too, in the Hamptons in season for 4 months in the summer.
We'll make sure to put all of that information below this interview when it airs because, why not? You can cut your time. Time is money, right? Especially when you're talking about an ultra high net worth individual. Time is money.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time, Rob. I really enjoyed this interview.
Same, Ria. Thanks so much for your time and your interest. It's been great talking to you.
You've been watching another edition of Yacht Crew Vlogs right here on Yachting International Radio. My name is Ria. I have been your host. We'll see you again next time.